Hello, and thank you for joining us for Native Plants in the Ecosystem, which will be about 50 minutes. My name is Jen Lutz, and I work for Wild Rivers Conservancy as the Operations Manager. I'll be in the background moderating the chat and helping with any technical difficulties during the session. Before we begin, I would like to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. On the right of your screen, you will see the chat box. To keep things simple, chat is where we would like for you to share your questions and comments. If you have any questions during the presentation, we encourage you to type those questions into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be made permanently available on the Wild Rivers Conservancy YouTube account. With the housekeeping out of the way, I would like to introduce our speaker and give the rest of our session time to them. Please welcome Alex Bouthilet, Seed Farm Manager with Wild Rivers Conservancy and partner with U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here so we can see my PowerPoint presentation. Make sure this works well. There we go. How's that working? All right, I'll get started as long as everyone can see my presentation that we're looking at. So title of Native Plants in the Ecosystem. As Jen was kind enough to introduce me, Alex Bouthilet. I work for the Wild Rivers Conservancy, but I'm technically supervised by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of near Richmond, Wisconsin, through a partnership with their friends group, the Friends of the St. Croix Wetland Management District. And my position is I run the seed farm for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that is basically we produce seeds of native plants for habitat restoration. So that's kind of the basis of what we're going to talk about. So with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are in what's called the St. Croix Wetland Management District. And that's an area in west central Wisconsin that encompasses 8 counties. And we currently have over 9,000 acres of public land divided amongst 44 waterfowl production areas. And those are little pieces of public land that are purchased with duck stamp dollars, which you need to buy if you want to hunt any migratory waterfowl. So 99 or 98 cents out of every dollar when you purchase one of those stamps goes into a pot and is used to purchase these lands. So we mostly purchase land based on, as you can see in this picture, the small wetland potholes, because that's good breeding habitat for ducks. But we're also doing, in general, habitat restoration projects. So we don't just do the duck production. We get to do habitat restoration on all of the lands. So we'll usually end up with old farmland, and we convert it into native habitat by planting seeds on it. And that's what we do here at the Star Prairie Seed Nursery, is produce those seeds so that we don't have to purchase them. We generally try to get seed from within 60 miles of where we're planting it. We try to get enough to seed 200 new acres per year. So we have a lot of volunteers that are picking a lot of this seed for us. And this Star Prairie Seed Nursery is so valuable because a lot of these species are very, very in decline and hard to find. And a lot of the things that we have there are not in a lot of other spots. It's one of the last little refuges of native plants. And then quickly, when we talk about native plants, it's a difficult thing to describe because there's a big difference between a wild plant and a native plant. So a wild plant basically is anything that grows naturally in the environment outside around here. That can include invasive species that we don't like and native species. We consider a plant to be a native plant if it's indigenous to a particular region. And that basically means that that plant was already growing there when white people first came and settled the area. These were the plants that had already evolved and grown here. So they are the plants that belong, not things that we moved in or invasive species that we accidentally moved in. And then a really quick note before we get really into everything, there is not a ton of information on a lot of these native plants in general. And there certainly isn't too much information on how they're adapting to climate change and dealing with it. But the basis of my passion for native plants and my presentation is basically that these native plants in the ecosystem where you have a biologically diverse ecosystem with a lot of different species, they create these resilient ecosystems that are extremely good at adapting to changes in climate, changes in weather patterns, changes in land management. They're very, very resilient, tough ecosystems that have it. They evolved here so that they're very, very well adapted to dealing with changes in the environment, floods, droughts, all of those things they've dealt with for probably thousands of years. So the vegetation types that we manage here at the Wetland Management District includes a lot of different things. The main component that we deal with is prairie. Prairie is basically a grassland ecosystem. So you're going to have species like grasses, like this is little blue stem here. And then you're going to have forbs and shrubs without trees. And when I say forbs, that's a fancy word for flowers. It just means flowering plants. So some of the common or beautiful prairie plants, this is puccoon, this is aromatic aster, wood lily, and then gentian. This is actually cream gentian. So the most important thing about prairie, it can be dry, it can be wet, but prairies are all full sun plants with almost no trees. So if you're standing in a prairie, there can be some shrubs, but most of it is going to be below the height of your head. So it's not going to be any sort of real shade component. Mostly plants that really like full sun. And that's basically what occurred in this area where our wetland management district is centered and where the Wild Rivers Conservancy is. That was historically all an open prairie. And this map was put together in 1976 by a professor who studied old survey data. Because when they originally surveyed all the land, they described what was where based on the vegetation types. So he put this together, and you can see this big yellow area right in St. Croix County historically was about 200,000 acres of open prairie with almost no trees. And that actually is the main thing that we're trying to restore. So it's what we call now the Western Prairie Habitat Restoration Area. So we're attempting to restore 20,000 acres of native prairie within that area to get to 10% of what was originally there. And as you can see, there's a lot of prairie in southern Wisconsin, but basically this was the northernmost reach of the tall grass prairie region in the entire state of Wisconsin, is right where we are. And then we have wetlands. I'm not the most experienced with wetlands because I don't like to walk up to my waist in water most of the time. Generally, a wetland is some sort of habitat that has either seasonal or permanent flooding. So this time of year, obviously, you see a lot of those seasonally flooded wetlands, those little pools that will dry up later into the summer. Those are still considered wetlands because there's more moisture in the ground. There's a complicated science to determine what is and isn't a wetland. They look at the soils, the way the water moves, all of the plants. I'm not super well versed in it. This is some of our coolest wetland species. This is skunk cabbage. I always say it kind of looks like an alien. It's a very interesting plant. It's actually in bloom right now, coming out of it was in bloom actually a couple of weeks ago, and it melts the snow when it comes out of the ground. So that's one of the earliest blooming wildflowers. And an interesting fact, because it blooms before most of the pollinators are out, it stinks and it attracts flies. So it smells almost like rotten meat. So flies are attracted to pollinate it. And then this is Michigan lily. Beautiful native lily. Looks a lot like tiger lilies, which are not native. This is marsh marigold, which will be in bloom soon. Wild calla. And then Sagittaria or arrowhead. And those are all specifically plants that you're only going to find in very, very wet environments. And another interesting note on wetlands, they can be full sun to full shade. Like technically a swamp is a wooded wetland. A marsh is a full sun wetland, but basically wetland, anything that is flooded at some point in the year. And then our most endangered habitat that we have here is called oak savanna. There is actually less than 0.01% of the original oak savanna that was in Wisconsin that still remains. So it's one of the most endangered habitats in the entire United States, and certainly in Wisconsin. It's by far the most diverse ecosystem because the characteristic of an oak savanna is some sort of canopy cover with trees. Usually these open trees like this basically an oak savanna is between a prairie and a forest. So that a lot of definitions are out there of oak savanna, and they range from 10 to 20% canopy cover. So either, 10, somewhere in between 10 to 60%. Somewhere in between 10 to 60% of the actual area is shaded, and the other percentage is unshaded. And what that does is allows for full sun plants out in the open, full shade plants, and then you get savanna specialist plants that will grow right under the oak trees or in certain areas that are shaded in the morning or areas that are shaded in the evening. So you end up with even more diversity, more and more native plants because of that varied habitat. And then we'll talk more about prescribed fire, but the oak savannas and the prairies exist mainly because of fire, because we only really have prairies and oak savannas because of fire, because everything around here in our local area, we receive enough rainfall that it will turn into a forest eventually. Out west, they have prairies because there's just not enough rainfall to support trees. But here, the only thing that would really keep the trees out is those constant fires. And a characteristic of a bur oak that grew in the open, you'll notice these big, long branches that just reach sideways. That's because they grew in the open. They didn't have to reach straight up for sun. They could reach in all directions. And when you start to notice the characteristic tree of the oak savanna, the bur oak, if you look closely at the really old specimens, they have a really thick, corky bark on them. And that's a response to fire. So that when the prairie fires would rage across the prairie like this, it actually doesn't harm the trees at all. They're perfectly insulated and well adapted to that fire. And then when, we talk about prairie, wetland, oak savanna, all of these different habitat types, one of the best parts about where we live is how they're all mixed so closely. So this is actually right here up off County Road H is the Star Prairie Seed Nursery, where we grow a lot of our seeds. And then this is a piece of public land called Oak Ridge Waterfowl Production Area. And then a quick note on these waterfowl production areas and this DNR land. These lands are all of ours. They belong to the public. We maintain the fish and wildlife and habitats on here for the benefit of the American people. So this is open to, actually this WPA has some specific hunting regulations during duck season, but every other waterfowl production area and piece of DNR land is open for you to use. That's what these lands are here for. It's a beautiful program. You can hunt based on regulations. You can fish. You can take pictures of wildlife. You can look at wildlife. You can take walks. You can snowshoe. Basically, any outdoor activity that you like to engage in, you are allowed to engage in on these federal lands. They belong to everyone. It's a wonderful program, and get out and use them because they're there for everyone. But after that quick note, this is our seed farm. And this is Oak Ridge Waterfowl Production Area. So you can see when you walk into Oak Ridge from the north end here, you're in a big open prairie. And then you come into what I was describing here, that savanna conditions where there's some trees in the open and then they're kind of cleared out amongst them. So you get that oak savanna. In here is a really thick woods. So even different plant communities. And then this is a large lake. So literally in traveling less than a mile, you can walk through prairie, oak savanna, woods, and then into wetland. So that's all of those different habitat types support all different sorts of native plants. So in that little walk, you will see all sorts of different native plants. And then those native plants support habitat. And we'll talk a lot about that. Real quick note, because I've got some cool facts about prairie roots here. An acre, if anyone isn't familiar when I refer to a single acre of land, an acre is around a football field. So a football field with the end zones is about 1.3 acres. So when I say an acre, just picture about close to a football field. So one of the most important things about these native prairie plants is their root systems. We're going to talk about all sorts of different benefits that these plants have, but I always like to tell people I like prairies and native habitats just because they're pretty. That's reason enough. The flowers are really beautiful to look at when they're in bloom. But even if you don't care about that, every living thing needs water, and that's what we get from these prairie roots. So because these plants are all perennials, which means they're long-lived, they come back year after year, they will put down very, very, very deep root systems. Like this is compass plant here, and it's theorized that this plant can live over 100 years. And that whole time it is putting down these long, long roots. And what that does, obviously, according to this poster, anchors the soil, right? So it stops erosion. The prairie on the top provides wildlife habitat. And then I'll talk, when I talk about fire, a little bit more about carbon. But these root systems are the reason that we have such rich farmland here, and the reason that we have water in the ground. Because all of these root systems, after 100 years, when this compass plant dies, all of these roots leave fertilizer in the ground, in addition to the fact that it leaves this big channel. So when it rains, the water actually can infiltrate back into the ground. And over here on the left, this is your Kentucky bluegrass, which is the main component of lawns. And you can see, based on the root system, it is simply not a very deep root system. It doesn't really anchor the soil or allow it to absorb water. And they've theorized that in a prairie like this, if you look at it, 60 to 80% of the biomass, so the actual living matter, is under the ground. And I always love to look at the prairie in the winter, because even though it looks dead and like nothing's going on, it's just dormant. All of these plants are alive under the ground. They're waiting for sunlight so they can spring up and reproduce. And the most interesting thing about this poster is on the back of it, there's some really cool facts. The most interesting is they did a study that 1 acre of prairie, so about a football field, can absorb 9 inches of rainfall every hour before there's any runoff. And if you know anything about rainfall, if we got 9 inches of rainfall within a day, we would have very, very severe flooding. That would be almost a catastrophic event. But due to these root systems, the prairie would be able to absorb that, not just in a day, but every single hour, because of those deep, deep channels. And that's, like I said, how our aquifers originally filled up with water, and how we ended up with that thick, deep, black topsoil that made this such an amazing, rich farming area. Another interesting fact is that an acre of prairie can produce 24,000 pounds of roots. And that's what you're looking at here. It's a really good illustration. And also 1 acre of established prairie can intercept 53 tons of water during a 1-inch-hour rain event. So that's 53 tons of water that doesn't run off into the ocean, that actually goes back into the ground in that normal cycle that these plants evolved with. So when we do habitat restoration with native plants, that is by far really the only way, as far as I'm concerned, to do habitat restoration. So the mushrooms and fungal communities in the soil are probably a big part of the prairie, but we don't know much about them, and we don't know how to really reproduce them like we do plants. Bison probably were historically a big part of the prairies around here, but we really can't just throw more bison on the landscape without some serious infrastructure like fencing. But it basically seems, this science is relatively new, but if we take these seeds, like here, this is showy goldenrod, so we'll clip this head off, put it in a bag, dry it, chop it into little pieces, and throw it out on new landscape. If you put the seeds of these native plants out there, basically you're creating the entire habitat, and it's the easiest way to do it. Because like I said, I can go out with this snippers and cut these compass plants heads and reseed the seed in a new area. And then the pollinators come in, and all the things that eat the pollinators come in. And we have that start of the base of the food web of those native plants that feed all the insects. Those insects feed birds and rodents. And then things eat those birds and rodents. And those that is the base of the entire food web on the prairie, is these native plants. So we can basically create new habitat for these species that are in decline, like monarch butterflies, by just collecting these seeds and putting them on the ground. It's really our only reasonable means of creating more habitat. Like, even if you wanted to manage for, if you're a deer hunter and you wanted to manage for more deer on your land, well, you don't just buy deer and release them. You plant the right species of plants to encourage healthier and more deer. And one of the most important things, and how they serve as the base of the food web, is that they provide immense amounts of food for wildlife. So here on the far right, this is called horse gentian or tinker's weed or wild coffee. There's a lot of different common names for these plants, but it's a very early blooming little red flower that is a great bumblebee and pollinator species. And then once it's pollinated, it develops these little orange berries, and they are absolute, just amazing. Like, they're like candy for turkeys and native birds. They love to eat these berries. So that's a part of why I like to plant them, right? We're trying to create more wildlife, so we're trying to plant the things that the wildlife need. So this here is about knee-high vegetation, so maybe 2 feet high. And this is actually at the seed farm, and I had no idea there was a turkey in here. I almost stepped on her. And she was hidden perfectly with her little nest of eggs underneath this cream indigo plant to hatch her babies. And it doesn't seem like the best cover, but when I did some research, the reason the turkey wanted to lay her eggs in here is because there are so many different flowers, that because of all those flowers, there's a lot of bugs. And that's what the little tiny turkeys, when they're hatched, they need to eat, small bugs. So she basically picks to lay her eggs in an area with lots of flowers, because the turkey knows it's going to mean lots of food for her babies. So it's, just like I said, it's the base of that food web. Also, as well, like every single one of the seeds that we harvest, I'm always competing with something native to get those seeds. Like some of the sunflower species, the goldfinches absolutely love those. But it's really a lot of fun to be out kind of competing with the native insects and the native birds, because they're interested in getting all of these seeds. I'm trying to get more of them, but at the same time, I'm very, very happy that they're utilizing it. So there's native species eating our technically crops, but that's what they're there for in the first place. So it's a really, really fun, unique experience to be harvesting native species along with other native species. And then when I talk about all of the different animals in a prairie, so I'm sure everyone has heard about pollinators, and we've probably heard about them today. And that's what the flowers attract. So the pollinators will get the nectar from the flower, move it to another one along with its pollen, and allows those plants to produce seed. But because these plants attract this diverse array of pollinators, there's even more things attracted to eat the pollinators. So these little garden spiders eat a lot of, there's always, usually around July, there's a day at the seed farm, they all wake up, and I come out in the morning, and in the dew, you can see a spider web, every single square foot of the prairie just covered in them. And the grasshoppers get caught, and the spiders eat them. But the spiders wouldn't be there if the flowers weren't there. Just like this little green tree frog on this stiff goldenrod. He's not there because he likes the flower. He's there because there are insects coming in to visit that flower, and that's what he wants to eat. So the flower is technically providing food to this little green tree frog. And I'm specifically a reptile and amphibian lover. I love snakes. And this is by far my favorite prairie animal. This is a bull snake. This is up by Grantsburg in the prairie up there. And that's another species that you think of as, not being related to plants. But this bull snake pretty much just eats ground squirrels and little rodents that are in the ground. And those little rodents are completely reliant on eating the plants. So without all of that diverse native plants, I wouldn't have my favorite species to find, which is these big bull snakes. And this isn't the best picture of how big this one was, but this is probably the biggest species of snake in Wisconsin. This snake was about 6 feet long. They can be a little aggressive, but they're beautiful, beautiful species. And then another species that we have at the seed farm. Sadly, this one got hit on the road and killed by the seed farm. But we were lucky enough to get it mounted as an example for the Fish and Wildlife Service. But this is another animal that is, I see the most badger in the areas with the most native plants. Because, like I keep saying, right, the native plants in the diverse mix of native plants leads to the most diverse mix and the largest number of rodents. And that's what these badgers do. They use these big claws to dig up and eat little rodent nests. And I was a little worried when this one got killed at the seed farm, like maybe that was our only badger. But a few weeks after this one disappeared, I saw a definite activity of badger. And it kind of reinforced my thinking that with these prairies, if you have these diverse, beautiful habitat with a lot of different native species that are well adapted, all of the animals are well adapted to use them. And if the animals are around, they're going to find these areas with the native plants and utilize them. And just a quick note, one of my favorite things I've ever seen at the seed farm, I love looking at pollinators, but I've watched little tiny wasps that are predatory flying around with grasshoppers twice their size, moving very, very slow, just taking them back to eat. It's a fascinating thing to watch. And seeing a flower with a little fly that visits to use, and then a big spider will pop out from under the flower and grab it and take the little pollinator down. And then this is some of the most fascinating stuff about prairie, and I'm sure everyone has heard about this at this point, but specialist insects. And the best example of that is the monarch butterfly. This is a monarch butterfly on New England aster, beautiful, beautiful purple aster species. And then this is a monarch caterpillar on common milkweed. And when we say specialist insects, we mean that they're just that. They specialize on usually one specific species of plants or one genus of plants, which is a group of a lot of closely related species. And with monarchs, it's milkweed. So milkweed, if you've ever torn off one of these leaves, you notice that milky white sap that it gets its name from runs out of the plant. And that sap is mildly toxic to a lot of different things that like to eat milkweed or that like to eat plants. But the monarch developed over long term of evolution, we think, a complex relationship where it is immune to the toxins in that white sap. So that's the only thing that monarchs can eat. And that's why we need milkweed for monarchs, because the monarchs will eat these flowers as adults for pollen and nectar, but in this caterpillar stage, they can only eat different milkweed species. So that's why we stress to people to plant milkweed, because it supports a specific butterfly species. And then just a really quick note, this is painted lady. These are really common butterflies. You'll see them around, but just as important. And they also have a whole specific group of plants that they can lay their eggs on. And I love that everyone is aware of this, because it's a good segue and a good way to explain exactly why every native plant is so important, right? We know milkweed is important because it supports the monarch butterfly. And here's another example. 2 monarch caterpillars, and this is actually a rare species of milkweed called dwarf milkweed. And I think the monarchs like it a little bit more than the other species of milkweed because it's a rare milkweed, and I always see monarch caterpillars on it. But this is another common milkweed here in Wisconsin, and these are red milkweed beetles. And basically, they are also just like monarchs, where they can only eat milkweed. They also have that complex relationship where they are milkweed specialists. And Wisconsin actually has 11 different species of milkweed specialists, ranging from caterpillars to caterpillars that turn into moths, caterpillars that turn into butterflies, these little red milkweed beetles. There's one that looks just like a little ladybug that specializes on milkweed. But basically, milkweed is really important for monarchs, but when we dig deep into it, we find it's way more than that. It's important for a lot of different species that specialize on eating the actual flesh of the plant, in addition to the fact that there's flowers on it and it supports native pollinators. Every native pollinator, even things that can't eat milkweed, still will utilize the flowers. Bumblebees don't really eat any vegetation at all, but they love to eat milkweed flowers. And then here, this is called red admiral butterfly, I think. Let me double check my notes. Yep. And this is another native butterfly you will see around, but this butterfly actually only lays its eggs on stinging nettle plants. And I don't know if I'm sure some of you are familiar with stinging nettle. I called it itchweed when I was growing up. It's a native plant that I don't particularly like or plant or encourage, but I certainly don't hate it or aggressively try to remove it from the landscape, because it is the host plant for these beautiful little butterflies that I like to see. So I deal with the fact that sometimes I walk through a patch of itchweed and I get a 10-minute reaction on my legs and they get itchy because this butterfly needs it. And then in this picture as well, this is a goldenrod gall some of you might have seen. And that's not even a pollinator relationship, but there's a little wasp that stings its egg into this stem, and the plant grows this to protect itself. And it's actually kind of almost a mutualistically beneficial relationship for the plant and the insect. But when we talk about specialist insects, there's also, besides just your cool pollinators, these are blister beetles. And this is actually white indigo. It's a native plant that is relatively rare on the landscape, but can do pretty well if you plant it. And this is actually what it looks like about right now. The whole bush will make these big seed pods. This is a half of one. These flowers turn into them. And then the whole bush snaps off and blows across the prairie like a tumbleweed. And that's how it spreads its seeds. But when we get back to these relationships, this isn't one of the most interesting relationships as far as I am concerned, because it's not necessarily beneficial. So this white indigo is a native species that we're trying to grow and produce seed of. But every year we get these black blister beetles. There will be clouds of them. They come through and they eat all of the flowers off every single one of the stalks. And it kind of, obviously, it definitely slows down our ability to get seed, because if the flowers are eaten, they're not going to get pollinated and turn into seeds. But these insects are actually native and they belong here. So I don't do anything to try to hurt them. It's a part of a natural process. It would be nice if we could get more seed of that species. But when you look out on the landscape, at the seed farm specifically, there's a lot of this white indigo. And most likely, these bugs are a natural check to the population that will stop it from really getting too aggressive, because it is kind of an aggressive species in the prairies. And when you think back to when that slide with the 200,000 acre prairie in this area, those plants would have been throughout that entire area. So the effects of this flower predation would have been less pronounced. It wouldn't have made such a big deal, and it probably would have been necessary to keep these plants from becoming too numerous on the landscape. In addition to these blister beetles that eat it, there's a native insect that eats the seeds. So even if the plant flowers and makes seed, and these blister beetles don't get it, there's often many of these little weevils in the seed, and they actually are another specialist. They're not a beautiful pollinator, but they're a great example of how almost every single one of these native plants has something specific native that relies on that plant to complete its life cycle. And these little weevils, without these indigo plants and seeds, would not be able to complete their life cycle. And they're native and they evolved here. So they might not be as pretty as monarchs, but they're just as important. And then this here is the seed that I have cleaned of them. These are the good seeds, mostly, you can see here. But when I play the video, you'll be able to see it's almost 90% little tiny weevils crawling around. And this is certainly not, this is not a job for someone who's afraid of bugs, because you'll come across a lot of them. But you can see all of these little teeny weevils crawling around. And that's what they're a native insect that eats the seed. So it's a really fun thing, because it's kind of frustrating, right? We would like to get even more seed to reseed more of it. But the whole reason we're seeding more of it in the first place is to encourage native species like these blister beetles and like these apion seed weevils that eat it. So it's a really, really fun thing that used to kind of upset me, because we were losing all of this extra seed. But what we're doing is creating habitat for these plants, right? Even these blister beetles and these seed weevils, they don't hurt the plant. They just hurt its ability to reproduce, because these plants are long-lived perennials. Every single flower can get eaten and every seed can get eaten, and the plant will come back next year. So it has continued opportunities to try to produce seed. And that's another thing with these plants and their ability to adapt to different changes in the environment. Because they live a long time and they evolved here, they can deal with 5-6 years of heavy seed predation, and then randomly one year something will happen, most likely, and these bugs will not be very heavy, and the plants will make a ton of seeds. We just have to take advantage of that when it actually happens. And then our most interesting specialist insect is the Karner blue butterfly. So this is one of the Fish and Wildlife Service, in addition to managing for waterfowl breeding, we get to manage for threatened and endangered species. So the Karner blue butterfly is actually one of the 2 endangered insects that we have in our area. They were added to the endangered species list by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1992. They usually like to live in pine barrens and oak savannas on sandy soils. And when I say pine barrens, that's basically like a pine savanna, like openly spaced pine trees, usually a fire-dependent ecosystem that burns at least occasionally. Just a tiny little butterfly, just about a 1-inch wingspan. They're probably a little bit, one of the reasons they're rare is because they're so friendly. As you can see, they will land right on your hand and lick sweat off of you. They're not afraid of people very much. But the little caterpillars, they can only lay their eggs on wild lupin. So like monarchs can only lay their eggs on milkweed species, but we have about 12 different milkweed species in Wisconsin, and the monarchs can use all of those species. Whereas this butterfly can only lay its eggs on one exact species of plant called wild lupin. But just like the monarch, the butterfly needs more than just that one species. It won't exist without that species of wild lupin for the caterpillars to eat. But also, if you don't have anything but that one species, the butterflies won't have food, because they like to nectar on things like this false Solomon seal. Go back again. And then this wood lily, and this little butterfly down in the bottom by the nectar here. That's just another reason you need those highly diverse habitats. And another quick note, like this false Solomon seal, it's a beautiful little white flower. I don't know much about it, but like I've been talking about, all of these examples of specialist insects, I wouldn't doubt that there is some sort of specialist little insect or fungus in the soil that has some sort of relationship with this species. You can almost say that about every one of these native plants when you start to learn more and more about them. Karners are really interesting too, because, and part of the reason probably that they're rare, besides the fact that there's not a lot of wild lupin and prairie left for them, is that they only fly twice a year. So they're going to emerge relatively soon. They'll fly, breed, lay eggs, and then all the butterflies die. That same cycle happens again later in the summer, and then all those eggs just sit there in the duff waiting for the spring again. So they're not around for the entire summer. There's usually 2 periods of about a week each where there's just clouds of them doing their reproduction and laying eggs, and then they all kind of die off. So they're not super well adapted to all of the environmental changes, and that's part of probably what's happened with them, because if they hatch at the wrong time and there's not enough flowers, they're just not going to be as successful as they could be. And then really quick on bumblebees, I know my sound isn't working, but I'm not the most well versed on all the pollinators. I know that bumblebees are by far the coolest pollinators. They're definitely the most effective pollinators because of their size. So they can fly in a lot of conditions that other bees can't. They also are more capable of pollinating because they do this thing called sonic pollination. They can actually disconnect their flight muscles from their wings, and they'll buzz. It makes a unique little noise. They'll buzz, and it actually shakes the pollen loose from the flowers. I'm sure you can't hear it, but that's what they're doing right now. Is they're making a distinctly different noise. And the same thing here. The bumblebee goes into the flower, does that little vibration, and then pollen just falls all over him. So by far the most effective pollinator. I didn't really have enough time to get into it today, but we have an endangered species of bumblebee at the seed farm called the rusty-patched bumblebee. They're at the seed farm. We have them around Osceola, New Richmond. They're pretty much anywhere that there is good flowers left. So it's another reason to be aware of and be an advocate for native plants, is that we actually can, in our local area, we can work specifically to save an endangered species, this rusty-patched bumblebee. And then when we talk about fire, so like I said, all of these prairies are mostly perennial plants. So one of the main reasons you need to burn them is because all of that, when we think back to that root poster, all of that growth on top, the actual flowers, when that dies, it just falls on top of the ground. And after enough of that falling on the ground, if it doesn't decompose quickly, it basically will suffocate the prairie and put a blanket basically over the top of where the root systems are, and they won't get warm enough to actually germinate. So when we burn, we're removing all of that, we call it duff, all of that dead material on the top of the prairie, and allowing sunlight to get down into those plants to allow them to start growing quickly. That was basically how these prairies were created in the first place, was the Native Americans would burn almost every year. They would burn for lots and lots of different reasons, mostly specifically for habitat, because they used the habitat. When they burned, a lot of it was to encourage berry production. They would use it to expose acorns for seed collection in oak savannas, prepare planting sites for new agriculture, control undesirable plant species and pests. They would burn to fireproof villages, and basically the main reason to create and maintain open woodlands and savannas, because that biodiversity led to, like they could see, more and more game species for the things they needed to eat. When they would do a burn, it would increase the berry production. They ate the berries. In addition to all the wildlife that they ate would eat the berries. So they could see that those effects cascade all the way up to the top of the food web. So it's by far the most important tool we have for maintaining. We can accomplish the same thing kind of with mowing or haying, but burning is better because it removes all of that material and it leaves the soil black. So because it leaves the soil black, everything is warm very, very quickly, and the plants start growing even more quickly. And some real interesting notes, because I've gotten questions on carbon emissions and prairie fires, because we put a lot of smoke into the sky on these prairie fires. You can see this. And yes, that is carbon going into the atmosphere. But what we're having, the most important thing to remember about prairie fires is that these prairie plants are taking carbon from their environment and storing it under the ground in those roots as organic carbon. So we've, like I said, we know that these prairies build these deep organic soils, and that's why they made such good farmland. But recently, it's gotten more notice about how they're able to store all of that carbon. but it's pretty obvious that we're releasing some carbon. But because when you burn a prairie, it makes it grow stronger and gets even more vegetative growth, that's going to sequester even more carbon in the soil than if it was unburned, because it's going to grow more vigorously. And like I said it before, these spring fires warm the soil and allow things to start growing earlier. So they grow more plants, more vigorously, bigger. In addition to the fact that these black areas, the fungal communities and bacteria in the soil is really stimulated by being warm quickly. And it helps all of those soil bacteria that help different plants get available nitrogen. And the most important thing about any carbon that we release, and how it's a net benefit of storing that carbon in the ground, all of this carbon that's getting released in this smoke is not fossil carbon that's responsible for our carbon dioxide levels going way up. Most of the carbon that's going up is carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere within the last few years for those plants to grow. So much of that carbon is actually sent down into the ground. So long term, these prairies are carbon sinks. We're recycling some back with this smoke, but most of it is going right back into the ground and being sequestered and held into those organic soils. And then really quick, just to show, I'm just about ready to wrap up for questions. This is the Star Prairie Seed Nursery, just outside of Star Prairie on Coney Road H. And this is a video I took. We burned it just this Tuesday. So this was very, very recent. So if you get a chance to drive by, you'll be able to see the black. And then with this nice rain, within a few weeks, the whole thing will turn green and there'll be flowers blooming. But this is just a good video of the fire. One of the fire trucks down there, but you can see how readily they burn. And that's always kind of a common joke I like to make is, if you can tell that a habitat is fire dependent if it burns. Like when you light a prairie on fire, you can really tell they evolved. It seems different, but it's extremely, extremely healthy. And that about wraps up.
Great. Well, Alex, thank you so much for that presentation. I just love listening to you share what you know, and I always learn a lot. We have a really active classroom in Amory that's been asking a lot of questions, and I think some of them you've answered actually in our last couple of minutes here. One of the questions that came up is, are oak trees the only trees that grow in oak savannas?
No, that's an amazing question. So generally if it's an oak savanna, it's going to be generally oaks, usually bur oaks and white oaks. But when I'm talking about mixing of habitat types, it wouldn't technically be an oak savanna, but you can have even weedy trees like a box elder tree can give you that component where you get some of those full shade plants and some of those savanna specialists. So you can get those savanna conditions. I mean, you could get it if you hung a shade cloth over a prairie, you would get more biodiversity.
Excellent. I know you shared some information with us about bull snakes. A curious mind wants to know, how old can the bull snake get?
I don't know that exact answer. I don't think they're super long lived. I would estimate around 10 years, but I'd have to look that up for sure.
So I did while you were continuing your talk. So you are right around that time frame. So about 12
nice.
years, I think. Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Another question that came in too was, how many acres of protected DNR land do we have in Wisconsin? I know that number has doubled since 2010, and right now it's at about 297,000 acres.
Beautiful. Yeah, I didn't know the answer to that one. There is a lot of public land out there to be taken advantage of. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the different areas, because like I said, I love working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, because that's what we do. Is we're there to increase the fish and wildlife for the benefit of the American people.
Mm-hmm. If somebody wanted to go and visit some of these prairie lands, where can students go locally to experience these prairies?
So if you go to, probably the best way would be to go to the Fish and Wildlife Service website and search for the St. Croix Wetland Management District. We have openings, we have links to all of our properties for our waterfowl production areas. But it's also, you have to do some searching because the DNR has their different land. I'm on the board for a land conservancy around Osceola called Standing Cedars that has public land. I don't know if anybody has it, but the best thing I can recommend is an app called Onyx that shows you who owns the land. So it shows you all of the public land in an area, but it's a difficult thing sometimes to find all of the public land.
Sure. How many native plant species do we have in the watershed and then throughout Wisconsin?
So I think that there's the estimates that I've heard is around 2,500 species of like flowers in Wisconsin. I can say within the watershed and what I harvest, I concentrate, we do probably 250 species of flowers and then maybe 50 species of grass on a good year. And that some species is 5 or 10 seeds and some species are 500 pounds. So
awesome. Well, and with that, it is 11:20, so it's time for our session to come to an Alex. Thank you for being here today. Again, always just fascinating and fun to hear your expertise on native plants. Thank you to all of the students and classrooms that joined in today. We hope that you're able to join us for the rest of our sessions throughout the afternoon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
thanks for having me.
You're welcome.